Introduction. Have you ever been in a situation where it felt like the world around you refused to accept you? Dr. Marcus Davis faced that reality in a brutal way. After moving to a new neighborhood, he encountered a racist neighbor determined to drive him out. But what happens next will surprise you. Before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss stories like this. And stick around to see how this story of injustice turns into a powerful lesson of courage and resilience. Dr. Marcus Davis finally parks his car in the driveway of his new home, a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood. He takes in the surroundings, quiet streets, well-manicured lawns, and the kind of place he's always dreamed of for his family. Although he's a respected doctor, this move marks a significant step in his life, something he and his wife worked hard for. But as Marcus unloads a few boxes from the car, he feels an uncomfortable gaze coming from one of the nearby houses. Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, watches Marcus's every move with scrutinizing eyes. When Marcus enters the house, he mentions to his wife, Emily, that he already feels like he's being watched. Emily, trying to reassure him, suggests that it's just the usual neighborhood curiosity. But the unease lingers. From the living room window, Marcus notices Mr. Johnson still standing on his porch, now speaking on the phone. Marcus can't hear the words, but something about Johnson's expression makes him uneasy. Am I overreacting, he wonders, but the sense that he's unwelcome in his own neighborhood starts to weigh on him. The next morning, Marcus dresses in his usual sharp attire and goes for a morning jog. As he runs through the tree-lined streets, the stares from the neighbors are not welcoming. They're distrustful. He overhears whispered conversations as he passes by, something he's always feared when entering spaces where he's seen as different. When he passes Mr. Johnson's house again, the man is there watching. This time, the hostility is clear in his expression. Marcus pretends not to notice, but the tension grows with each step. Later that day, Marcus is in his backyard, trying to relax with a book. However, his state of alertness spikes when he sees a police car slowly rolling down the street, coming to a stop in front of his house. Two officers get out of the car, and as they approach, Marcus feels the weight of the situation. With no apparent reason, he already knows this visit isn't casual. Something is about to happen, and he senses that Mr. Johnson is behind it. When the police knock on the door, Marcus keeps his cool. "Can I help you with something, doctor?" Emily asks from inside, but Marcus, maintaining his calm, responds, "I think it's fine. Just a misunderstanding." But he can't shake the feeling that this misunderstanding could escalate. Doubt and tension start to build like a storm cloud over him. The sound of tires slowly scraping against the asphalt announced the arrival of a police car. Marcus, who had been finishing up watering the plants in the yard, felt a warm summer breeze brush against his face. But the tranquility of the moment was interrupted by the sight of the approaching officers. The muffled sound of footsteps echoed on the pavement, each step seeming heavier than the last. When they stopped in front of him, the older officer, with a firm and slightly dry voice, began. "We received a report of suspicious behavior in this area," he said, adjusting his belt, the slight creak of the leather barely audible. The midday heat intensified the smell of hot asphalt, and Marcus felt a bead of sweat slowly trickle down the back of his neck. But he remained calm. "Suspicious behavior?" Marcus asked, his deep voice controlled. "I'm Dr. Marcus Davis. I just moved here. Does this have something to do with me?" "We need to see some identification," the officer continued, while the younger one, clearly nervous, looked around as if expecting some sign of danger. Marcus noticed their discomfort, but stayed composed. With calculated movements, he reached for his driver's license in his back pocket and handed it over with a forced smile. As the officers examined the documents, the creak of a rusty gate in the distance distracted Marcus. Mr. Johnson, with a barely concealed look of satisfaction, slowly approached, pretending to be an innocent bystander. But Marcus knew exactly what was happening. The smell of freshly cut grass filled the air, but nothing seemed to ease the rising tension Marcus felt. "We've received calls about an unfamiliar man wandering around here," the younger officer remarked, his emotionless eyes fixed on the papers. "Are you sure you live here?" Marcus glanced quickly at Emily, who was watching everything from the window, her eyes filled with anxiety. She opened the door and walked up to him. "This is my husband. We're new here, but why all the suspicion?" Johnson took a step forward. "I saw him walking around yesterday and again this morning. It seemed odd. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay around here," he said in a tone that sounded fake, as if he were just helping. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. The sun beat down hard on his forehead, but the cold grip of injustice crept through his body. He glanced briefly at Johnson, holding back his anger. "I'm walking down the street because I live here, Mr. Johnson. Is there a problem with that?" Johnson feigned surprise at Marcus's response, but there was something dark in his eyes. "No offense meant," he said with an ironic smile. "It's just that we're not used to strangers around here, especially someone who, well, doesn't exactly fit in." Emily interrupted, her voice trembling with frustration as the distant sound of a bird echoed in the hot afternoon. "What right do you have to accuse someone without reason, Mr. Johnson?" Marcus remained calm on the outside, but inside his chest tightened. He could smell the wet earth from the garden, the only thing that seemed real at that moment, while the weight of prejudice became suffocating. "Look, officer, this is just a misunderstanding," he said, turning to the officers. "I work at the city hospital. I'm not a suspect, I'm just someone who recently moved in." The officers, however, didn't seem satisfied. "Even so," the older officer said, his voice slow and deliberate, "we need to make sure everything checks out here. Can you show us some documentation for the house, maybe the deed or purchase agreement?" Emily lost her patience, the heat amplifying her irritation. "This is ridiculous. He's already shown you his ID. What else do you need? Proof that we're human." Her voice echoed off the walls of the entryway, creating a hollow sound that reverberated through the tense moment. Marcus touched her arm, trying to calm her. "Let me handle this, Emily," he said, feeling the sweat now pooling at the collar of his shirt. He walked inside, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath his feet, while the familiar smell of old books and polished wood briefly comforted him. He returned with the house deed and handed it to the officers. The silence as the officers reviewed the papers was almost deafening. The distant sound of children playing in the street contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. Finally, the officers handed the documents back with a curt nod. "Everything looks in order," the older officer said with detached indifference. "Have a good day, doctor." As the police car drove away, the smell of freshly cut grass and the chirping of birds once again dominated the surroundings. But the impact of the injustice had already left its mark. Marcus looked at Mr. Johnson, who had retreated into his house, clearly pleased with the disturbance he had caused. Marcus's humiliation was silent, but profound. He stepped back into the house without saying a word, Emily by his side, both emotionally drained. The air conditioning finally offered physical relief from the suffocating heat outside, but the emotional weight of the day lingered. Marcus felt the tightness in his chest, the reality that, despite his status and hard work, his skin color still defined how many people saw him. The comfort he had hoped to find in his new home had transformed into an invisible prison of prejudice and scrutiny. The days following the incident with the police are heavy. Marcus feels the constant stares from the neighbors with every step he takes, as if he's on stage but has no control over the narrative. The rustling of the wind through the trees seems to echo the tension in the air. As Marcus walks along the sidewalk to retrieve the mail, he overhears hushed conversations from across the street. Two neighbors, who previously offered polite nods, now whisper and glance at him suspiciously. He tries to ignore it, but their words cut deep. "That's him. I heard the cops were at his house the other day." "Well, he's not exactly the type of person we expected around here, is he?" Marcus feels the cold pavement under his bare feet, and the humiliation seeps in. He swallows hard and goes back inside, Emily, sitting in the living room, sees the tension on his face and asks, "What happened, Marcus? Is everything okay?" He just shakes his head and sinks into the sofa, frustration building inside him. The air-conditioned room, though cool, now feels stifling, as if the external pressure was seeping into every corner of the house. The next day, as Marcus heads out for work, he notices something odd in his driveway. The strong smell of burnt rubber lingers in the air, and as he approaches, he sees dark tire marks on the pavement, as if someone had deliberately spun their tires there. The frustration he'd been controlling begins to bubble to the surface. "Emily, did you see this?" he calls out to his wife, his voice laced with indignation. She rushes out, her hands still damp from washing dishes, the soapy scent mixing with the smell of burnt rubber. "What now?" The sight of the tire marks makes her face tighten with concern. "This isn't a coincidence. They're doing this on purpose, provoking us," Marcus says, clenching his fists. The distant sounds of neighbors leaving for work and cars passing by seem muted as he stares at the marks, a clear reminder that, even in silence, he is under attack. Emily gently touches his arm, trying to calm him, but he knows this is just the beginning. Later that day, Marcus decides to make a quick stop at the local supermarket, something that used to be a simple routine task. Inside, the air is cool, the hum of the air conditioning blowing hard, but Marcus feels the discomfort of eyes on him. As he picks out some fruit, he notices the store manager, a tall man with a severe expression, watching him from a distance, his gaze fixed as though expecting Marcus to do something wrong. "Can I help you with something?" the manager asks abruptly, approaching Marcus with firm steps. The smell of cleaning products and the sound of shopping carts rattling fill the background, but the coldness in the air only heightens Marcus's unease. "No, I'm just getting what I need," Marcus replies, trying to keep his tone calm. But the manager's stare remains accusatory. "It's just we've had some trouble recently, so we're being more cautious." "I'm sure you understand," the man says, his tone dripping with suspicion. Marcus closes his eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply. "I understand perfectly," he says, fighting the urge to snap. He grabs his groceries and heads to the checkout, but the feeling of being watched, judged, is a constant shadow. That night, as Marcus and Emily prepare for bed, a loud crash outside startles them both. "What was that?" Emily asks, panic already in her voice. Marcus rushes to the window and sees something glinting on the ground in the driveway. He runs downstairs, his heart pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins. Outside, the sight freezes him for a moment. The car window is shattered, shards of glass glittering in the faint moonlight. And on the hood, spray-painted in red letters, are the words, "Get out." The night air is cold, and the smell of fresh paint is suffocating, a violent reminder of the hatred surrounding them. Emily joins him, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Marcus, it can't be." "It's Johnson," Marcus mutters, his voice low and filled with a rage he's been trying to suppress. "He's behind this. Him and all those neighbors who look at us like intruders." Sitting on the living room sofa, Marcus feels the weight of everything that has happened over the past few weeks. The muted ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of the city contrast sharply with the turmoil in his mind. He looks over at Emily, who's lying on the couch beside him, staring up at the ceiling, clearly just as distressed. The stress in the air is palpable. He can hardly breathe under the pressure. "I can't keep living like this," he finally says, breaking the silence that has taken over the house. His voice is low but steady. "I worked my whole life to get here, and now they want to drive me out?" Emily sits up, gripping his hand tightly. "We're not going to give in. They want to intimidate us, but we won't let them." "You're stronger than this, Marcus." The silence returns as Marcus reflects on her words. The smell of coffee from the kitchen wafts into the living room, offering a momentary comfort. But the tension in the air is undeniable. He knows he needs to make a decision soon, before this situation consumes him completely. Marcus sits at the table, the smell of slightly burnt toast lingering in the kitchen. He barely notices his coffee growing cold in the cup as he stares into the distance. Emily, sitting beside him, runs her fingers over the stack of bills, her worried eyes fixed on them. Suddenly, the doorbell rings, a sharp sound that echoes through the house. They exchange glances, tension evident in their eyes. "Who could that be now?" Emily whispers, her voice filled with apprehension. "I'll get it," Marcus replies, standing up slowly. His footsteps echo through the silent house. When he opens the door, he's met by a man in a suit, with an elegant appearance and a warm smile. "Dr. Davis? I'm Michael Landon, a civil rights attorney. I've heard about what's been happening to you and your family." He extends a firm hand, a gesture that sparks a glimmer of hope in Marcus. Of course. Please come in," Marcus says, surprised, guiding Landon into the living room. Emily watches from a distance, her questioning eyes following their every move. Once seated, Landon explains, "I've heard about the situation with Mr. Johnson and the other neighbors. What you're going through is more than just immoral, it's illegal. And I'm here to help. No one should have to go through this, especially someone who's contributed so much to the community, like you." Marcus stares at the lawyer for a moment, processing his words. "Do you really think we have a chance to change this? They're all against us." Landon smiles confidently. "Dr. Davis, cases like yours are exactly what drives me. We have the law on our side. It might take time, it might be difficult, but I guarantee you, you have a chance." Emily, now sitting beside Marcus, speaks up, her voice filled with emotion. "Will this really work? I just want us to have peace. I can't stand living like this anymore." Landon looks her straight in the eye. "I can't promise it will be easy, but I can promise I'll fight for you. And yes, this can work." Marcus looks at Emily, and for the first time in weeks, he sees something different on her face, a spark of hope. In the weeks that follow, Landon's presence brings a sense of relief. The attorney contacts local authorities, prepares a formal complaint against Johnson and the neighbors, and starts building the case with evidence of discrimination. The Davis household, once tense and oppressive, now feels a little lighter. During breakfast one morning, Marcus and Emily discuss the situation. "I feel like things are finally changing," Emily says, stirring her coffee, the soft clinking of the spoon echoing in the kitchen. "The neighbors seem less hostile." Marcus nods, gazing out the window. "Yesterday, while I was walking down the street, I saw a few of them. They didn't look at me the same way. Maybe they're realizing we're not giving up." Emily smiles, something he hasn't seen her do in a while. "That's good, Marcus." "Finally." "Yeah," he replies, though his tone carries a note of caution. "I just hope it lasts." A few days later, Landon organizes a community meeting at the local center. The atmosphere is cold, both from the excessive air conditioning and the tension that dominates the room. The sound of chairs being dragged across the floor echoes through the hall as the neighbors gather. Mr. Johnson is there, his eyes locked on Marcus from across the room, his gaze filled with undisguised hostility. Around him, other residents sit down, some with neutral expressions, others clearly uncomfortable. Landon begins the meeting, his voice resonating throughout the room. "We're here today to discuss something that affects everyone in this community: mutual respect and the right for everyone to live in peace. Dr. Davis and his family have been targets of harassment and discrimination, and that cannot continue." Some neighbors murmur among themselves, while others remain silent. Marcus, sitting beside Emily, feels Johnson's gaze piercing through him. With a voice dripping with sarcasm, Johnson raises his hand to speak. "I don't know what this doctor is talking about. I was just looking out for the neighborhood's safety. If he felt offended, that's not my fault." Marcus takes a deep breath, his voice firm but controlled. "You know exactly what you did, Johnson. From the moment we moved in, you haven't given us a moment's peace. You called the police for no reason, stirred the neighbors against us. This goes beyond just being concerned for safety." Johnson lets out a dry, mocking laugh. If you think this is discrimination, then maybe you're in the wrong neighborhood, doctor. The tension in the room rises. Landon intervenes, his voice steady. Mr. Johnson, your behavior is under investigation, and we will make sure justice is served. Marcus feels a mix of satisfaction and anger. He sees some neighbors exchanging worried glances, as if they're beginning to reconsider their actions. Maybe this will actually work, Marcus thinks, feeling a small sense of relief. However, that false sense of truce doesn't last long. 2 days after the meeting, Marcus is driving home after a long day at the hospital. When he turns the corner onto his street, what he sees makes his stomach drop. Hanging from Mr. Johnson's porch is a white banner with bold red letters. "We don't want strangers here." The night air is cool, but Marcus's chest tightens. The distant sound of barking dogs seems to echo the aggression of the message. He parks the car in front of his house and slowly steps out. Emily, who had been sitting on the porch waiting for him, stands up, horrified at the sight of the banner. "Marcus, this can't be happening again," she says, her voice full of despair. "I knew this would happen," Marcus replies, his fists clenched. "They're not going to stop." Emily walks over to him, tears welling up in her eyes. "What else can we do? We've tried everything. They just won't accept us." Marcus takes a deep breath. The strong smell of freshly cut grass now overshadowed by the stench of the fresh paint used to write the hateful message. "All they want is to force us out. But I'm not giving up, Emily. I can't." That night, the silence in the Davis house is heavy. The sound of the ceiling fan spinning is the only noise filling the room. Marcus sits on the sofa, his head in his hands. Emily is next to him, but both remain silent, unsure of what to say. "I thought we were finally turning the page," Marcus says, breaking the silence, his voice tired. "But it seems like no matter what we do, they'll never accept us." Emily grips his hand, her fingers trembling. "Maybe it's time we fought in a different way," she says, her voice barely audible. Marcus looks at her, his eyes filled with pain. "What do you mean? What else can we do?" Emily swallows hard. "I don't know, but we can't give in. They want us to feel defeated, to leave. We can't give them that." Marcus sighs deeply, looking up at the ceiling as the fan continues to spin. "I don't know how much longer I can take this, Emily. I just don't know." Emily, holding his hand firmly, responds with determination. "We'll find a way." Together, it was a sunny Saturday morning, but the heat that should have brought comfort only intensified Marcus's sense of unease. The strong smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, but he could barely taste its bitter, comforting flavor as he gazed out at the garden through the window. The leaves of the trees swayed slightly in the breeze, and the muffled sound of birds could not calm his spirit. Emily sat at the table, flipping through the pages of a magazine, but Marcus knew she was worried too. Her fingers tapped incessantly on the edge of the table. The silence between them was filled with a tension that seemed to grow with every passing second. "Do you think things will change?" Emily asked, finally breaking the silence, her voice soft but heavy with uncertainty. Marcus let out a deep sigh, placing his cup in the sink, the sound of ceramic hitting metal echoing through the kitchen. "I don't know. It feels like every time we take a step forward, something pulls us back." He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the sweat accumulate at the back of his neck. The sound of a car screeching down the street startled them both. The loud screech of tires against asphalt was unmistakable. Marcus walked over to the window and, pulling back the curtain, saw Johnson's car coming to an abrupt stop in front of their house. The smell of burnt rubber mixed with the midday heat, creating a suffocating sensation. "Him again?" Emily murmured, glancing over Marcus's shoulder, her eyes filled with worry. "I'll handle this," Marcus said firmly, though his heart was racing in his chest. Stepping outside, the heat felt suffocating, the sun reflecting intensely off the asphalt, creating distorted waves in the air. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower and Johnson's heavy footsteps as he got out of his car. He seemed larger than usual, his arrogant posture and the look of contempt fixed on Marcus. "So, Doctor," Johnson began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you're still here. I thought you would have gotten the message by now." Marcus stopped on the sidewalk, the smell of freshly cut grass and the heat of the sun amplifying the weight of the situation. His heart raced, but he kept calm, taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm not going anywhere, Johnson," Marcus said, with a calmness that contrasted with the storm building in his chest. "You can try as hard as you want, but my family and I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Johnson let out a short, dry laugh that reverberated down the empty street. "Right? You think you have a right to be here? You don't belong in this place." Marcus's eyes narrowed, the heat now feeling like a constant pressure on him. "This isn't about who belongs or not. This is about you and your inability to accept that the world is changing." Johnson stepped closer, the strong smell of alcohol emanating from him now nauseating. "You don't know anything, Doctor. People like you'll never fit in here." "I'm already here," Marcus replied, his voice filled with frustration, but still controlled. "And you're going to have to deal with it." The two men stood face to face, the air between them thick with tension. Marcus could feel the sweat trickling down his temples, while the smell of motor oil and the distant sound of a dog barking created an atmosphere of unbearable intensity. Suddenly, the front door of a nearby house opened, and a neighbor, who had been silently watching from a distance, stepped onto her porch, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the two men. She didn't say anything, but her presence amplified the weight of the moment. Marcus knew more people were watching, even if they didn't say so out loud. He could feel the stares coming from the nearby windows and porches, each person waiting for the next move. "What are you going to do, Johnson?" Marcus finally allowed his anger to surface in his voice. "Are you going to keep up with these veiled threats, pretending this is about neighborhood safety? Or are you finally going to admit that all of this is about your ridiculous prejudice?" Johnson turned red, anger clearly pulsing through his veins. "You're out of line, Doctor. I run this neighborhood, and I'm going to make sure people like you know your place." The explosion was imminent, and Marcus knew it. But before he could respond, Johnson shoved him hard, the gesture so unexpected that Marcus lost his balance for a moment. The impact caused him to stumble backward, and Emily, who had been watching from the porch, let out a scream. "Marcus!" She ran toward him, fear written all over her face. Marcus got back to his feet, the bitter taste of humiliation burning in his throat, but he kept calm. His eyes burned with controlled anger as he stared firmly at Johnson. "You think this will scare me, Johnson? All it proves is that you're the real problem here." The sound of sirens cut through the air, a sharp noise that made everyone on the street pause. The police car approached quickly, its lights flashing, and the once quiet street turned into a scene of pure tension. Landon, the lawyer, was with the police, his expression stern as he stepped out of the car. Johnson took a step back, now visibly nervous. "You've got to be kidding me, right? You called the cops over this?" The officers approached with firm steps, their heavy boots thudding on the hot asphalt. "Mr. Johnson, we're going to need you to come with us to give a statement," said the older officer, his voice low but authoritative. Johnson looked at Marcus, his face a mix of anger and disdain. "This is ridiculous. I'm protecting my neighborhood." Landon stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Protecting? What you're doing is harassment and intimidation. And that, Mr. Johnson, has consequences." "Consequences?" Johnson laughed bitterly, but now his voice faltered. "This isn't over, Doctor. You may have the law on your side, but you'll never have these people's respect." "I don't need your respect, Johnson," Marcus responded, his voice filled with a powerful calm. "All I need is for you to understand that you can't keep doing this without facing the consequences." As Johnson was handcuffed and led to the police car, the neighbors began to emerge from their homes. The sound of murmurs grew louder, and Marcus could feel the weight of their stares on him. Some neighbors were clearly shocked by what they had witnessed, while others, like the elderly neighbor, seemed regretful for having stayed silent for so long. The woman approached slowly, her eyes downcast. "Dr. Davis, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have let it get this far." Marcus looked at her, feeling the tension in his body beginning to ease. "Sometimes silence is just as harmful as actions," he said, his voice firm but without bitterness. She nodded, her hands trembling. "I hope there can be peace now." Emily, standing beside Marcus, took his hand. The warmth of her touch brought some comfort, and he finally felt the weight of the past weeks starting to lift. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the street, the atmosphere seemed to shift. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the street, the atmosphere finally seemed to change. The sound of the police sirens faded into the distance, and the neighbors' murmurs gradually died down. Marcus stood still for a moment, feeling the residual warmth of the pavement beneath his feet and the soft touch of the breeze on his face. The air was lighter now, and the constant pressure of being watched was finally beginning to lift. Emily stayed by his side, her hand still firmly in his. "I think it's over," she whispered, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Marcus let out a long sigh, as if he were exhaling all the tension he had built up over the past few weeks. He looked at the neighbors, now dispersing, some still watching from a distance, others retreating back into their homes. Even those who used to whisper or avert their gaze seemed hesitant, maybe even a little ashamed. The confrontation with Johnson had changed something, not just for him, but for the entire community. "Do you think things will really change now?" Emily asked, her eyes meeting Marcus's with a silent question that seemed to reflect everything they had been through. Marcus looked toward the horizon, watching the last golden sparks of the sunset fade away. "I don't know, but in some way, I feel like we took a big step today. They know we're not going to take this silently anymore." Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face for the first time in weeks. "I always knew you were stronger than they thought." A few minutes later, after the street finally fell silent again, Landon approached Marcus and Emily, wiping dust off his hands. "Good job, Doctor. You handled that with a lot of dignity. Not everyone would have kept their cool like you did." Marcus nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "It was hard. There were moments when I wanted to, explode. But I knew if I did, I'd be playing right into his hands." "You did the right thing," Landon said firmly. "Justice isn't quick, and it's not always clean, but you're on the right path. And now, Johnson will face the consequences." Emily, still holding Marcus's hand, turned to Landon. "What about the other neighbors? Do you think this will affect them?" Landon glanced around, taking in the quiet houses and the shadows of neighbors still peeking from behind their windows. "It might take a while for their attitudes to change, but trust me, the example has been set. And now, they know Marcus isn't alone." The three stood in silence for a moment, the distant sound of a quiet night replacing the tension that had dominated the day. Stars were beginning to appear in the sky one by one, and the air felt fresher, almost clean, as if a new phase was beginning. "Well, I think that's it," Marcus said with a small smile. "I still don't know how this will all play out, but I know we accomplished something important today." Landon shook Marcus's hand. "We definitely did. I'll take care of the legal process from here. Just rest now, Doctor. You've done enough." Later that night, Marcus and Emily sat together on the front porch, the night sky twinkling with stars. The air was cool, and the soft sound of crickets created a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. The smell of damp earth after the heat of the day was refreshing, a welcome contrast to the weeks of tension and fear. "It was a hard battle," Marcus said, his voice calm but still reflecting the exhaustion. "But you won, Marcus," Emily replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "You proved that no one can bring us down, and more importantly, you showed that we're not going to run away." Marcus remained silent for a moment, absorbing Emily's words. He looked out at the street, now quiet, with no signs of hostility or confrontation. He knew there were still challenges ahead, that racism and prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight. But for that night, he allowed himself to feel the relief and victory that filled his mind and heart. "I just hope this means something bigger for us and for those who come after us," he finally said, his voice filled with hope. Emily smiled and gently kissed his cheek. "It does, and today was just the beginning." As they continued to sit there, side by side, Marcus felt that for the first time since they had moved into the neighborhood, maybe, just maybe, they had finally found a place where they could be seen and heard for who they truly were. And that, he thought, was the greatest triumph of all. 2 weeks after the confrontation, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had visibly changed. Johnson had been formally charged with harassment and racial discrimination, and his case was progressing. The community, which had once silently watched the attacks and provocations, was now starting to speak out more clearly. Some neighbors who had previously avoided Marcus and Emily were now more receptive, nodding and greeting as they passed by, and even stopping to chat. In Landon's office, Marcus and Emily sat across from the attorney, who was reviewing some documents. The smell of freshly printed paper filled the room, while sunlight streamed through the glass window, bathing the space in a soft glow of hope. Landon looked up from the papers and smiled. "The case against Johnson is solid. He'll be forced to face the consequences of his actions, not just for the physical aggression, but for the pattern of discriminatory behavior he's demonstrated." "Does that mean he'll have to leave the neighborhood?" Emily asked, her voice filled with anxiety. "Because, honestly, I don't know if we can keep living here with him around." Landon paused, crossing his hands over the table. "It's possible that he'll have to move, yes. And with the fallout from all this, I doubt he'll be able to maintain the good neighbor reputation he pretended to have. But the most important thing is that from now on, any racist or discriminatory actions in this neighborhood will be dealt with under the full weight of the law." Marcus glanced at Emily, feeling a wave of relief at the realization that they finally had the protection they needed. The environment that had once felt hostile now seemed less threatening. "We're finally turning the page," he said. That afternoon, while Marcus was watering the plants in the backyard, he heard light footsteps approaching through the grass. When he turned around, he saw one of the neighbors who had once participated in the gossip and suspicious looks, now with an embarrassed expression. "Dr. Davis," she began, her voice low and hesitant. "I just wanted to apologize for everything that happened. I should have acted differently. I should have spoken up, should have stood by you and your wife. But I stayed silent. And I know that was wrong." The soft sound of wind rustling the leaves of the trees filled the air as Marcus considered her words. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the genuine regret. "Silence can be just as dangerous as words," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "But the fact that you're here now means something." She nodded, her eyes moist. "I just want you to know that things have changed for many of us. We're going to make sure that you feel welcome from now on." Marcus smiled slightly. "Thank you. That's all we want." She smiled back, visibly relieved, and walked away slowly, leaving Marcus to reflect on the impact his actions and the courage to stand his ground had on the community. Scene 3. Justice and Reflection. A few days later, news spread throughout the neighborhood. Johnson had decided to sell his house. The pressure of the legal action and the shift in the neighbors' attitudes had led him to this decision. The neighborhood, once dominated by his oppressive control, was about to be free of his influence. When Marcus received the news, he felt a mix of relief and reflection. The sound of children's laughter playing in the streets had returned, and life seemed to be, at last, getting back to normal. However, he knew that the fight wasn't just against one person. It was against a mindset that still existed, even if in a more subtle form. "You did it," Emily said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "Johnson is leaving. It's all over." Marcus remained silent for a moment, looking at the horizon. "Yes, Johnson is gone, but the fight doesn't end with him. There are others like him, maybe less obvious, but just as dangerous. What we faced here can happen anywhere, Emily squeezed his hand, understanding the depth of his thoughts. But here, now things are changing. People are changing. And that, Marcus, is because of what you did. You didn't back down. I think that's what matters, Marcus finally said, smiling. Even when it feels impossible, you need to keep standing. In the end, that makes all the difference. With the sale of Johnson's house, the atmosphere in the neighborhood transformed in a palpable way. The sound of hammers and nails echoed through the streets as new residents prepared to move in. For the first time since they arrived, Marcus and Emily started to feel like they truly belonged. One afternoon, while walking together through the neighborhood, the neighbors who used to avoid them now greeted them warmly. The smell of barbecue and freshly cut grass filled the air, and Marcus realized how small changes could make a big difference. As they turned the corner, they came across a group of kids playing ball in the street. When the children saw Marcus, one of them shouted, "Hey, Dr. Davis," and waved excitedly. Marcus waved back, feeling a wave of gratitude and belonging that he hadn't felt before. Emily looked at him and smiled. "See? They know who you are, Marcus. You earned this." He smiled back. "Yeah, I guess I did." That night, back on the porch, Marcus and Emily gazed at the stars. The soft smell of the night air, mixed with the sound of crickets, brought a sense of peace. For the first time, they could truly relax, without feeling like they were being watched or judged. "Do you remember the first night we spent here?" Emily asked, tilting her head toward him. "You were so nervous. You didn't know what to expect." Marcus smiled, remembering the moment. "Yeah, I was. And if I'd known what was coming, I might have hesitated to move." Emily laughed softly. "But you didn't hesitate. And now we're here. And that makes it all worth it." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air. He knew there were still challenges ahead, that the fight for equality and respect wouldn't end with Johnson's departure. But for that night, he allowed himself to savor the victory. As he watched the stars shining in the dark sky, Marcus finally felt that, in some way, they had not only achieved justice, but also the respect and belonging they had so long deserved. Conclusion: Dr. Marcus Davis's story teaches us that even in the face of injustice and prejudice, resilience and dignity can transform not just one life, but an entire community. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Marcus's place? Have you faced a similar situation? Leave your comment below. I read them all. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Together, we can continue spreading messages of justice and equality.